Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with Under Capitalism. If your head aches, they just yank off your head. A collection of poetry by Ariel Francisco. This collection was published in 2022, and I decided to give this a read because April was actually Poetry Month. And so in the month of April, I happened to see on Twitter that this poet had a new collection out. And I thought, let me support the poets of the world and buy this collection. And I went ahead and bought actually 3 other collections of poetry that I'm going to get through the course of the year. So there'll be chats on these 3 different collections. Poems by Reyes, Cárdenas, Deaf Republic collection by Ilya, Kaminsky, and then Ariel Francisco's actually first collection of poetry, All My Heroes Are Broke. I'll have this coming up at some point this year as well, once I get some time to spend with those poems. So Ariel Francisco has published 3 collections of poetry, and this collection is actually the 3rd. I read through the 2nd collection, A Sinking Ship Is Still a Ship, a couple of years ago, and really enjoyed that collection and still revisit those poems periodically because I just loved them. Because I love the way that this poet really engages with the everyday. You know, his poems really reflect a certain outlook on life. You know, it's an outlook that really looks at the beauty and the irony sometimes of really just mundane things. And I'm going to illustrate that by walking through some of these poems that I pulled out that I particularly enjoyed here. But you know, this particular collection really pertains to his family. The poet is from, I think his mother's from Guatemala originally, and his father was originally from the Dominican Republic. And so he is the child of immigrants, and the poems take place all around really New York City, Bronx, Manhattan, Brooklyn, really all over New York City, and you know, really reflects sort of this sort of everyday life in New York from his perspective. And you know, I just think they're so cool and so beautiful, and so beautiful, funny. You know, there's a whole lot of different aspects here that I enjoy. But let's just read through some of them. The way I counted them up, it looks like there's 49 total poems in this collection. They're in both English and Spanish. So each poem there's a Spanish version and an English version. I mentioned that this really pertains a lot to many of the poems pertain to his family. His father was also a poet, and so a few of these poems are actually by his father. And then one of the poems is about when he learns that his grandmother was also a poet. So anyway, really family oriented here. This collection is actually dedicated to his uncle, who apparently looks like passed away in 2020. But you know, just to go through a few of these and pull out some that I particularly enjoyed. A poem called "Along the East River and in the Bronx, Young Men Were Singing After Lorca." This poem is just really beautiful because it's really, the first line says, "I heard them and I still hear them, above the threatening shrieks of police sirens, above the honking horns of morning traffic." The poem then goes on through lots of other sounds of, you know, this area of the Bronx where he is, and yet, you know, he hears the young men singing. So, you know, really just sort of a beautiful mood that is struck with that poem, I think, because you hear, on the one hand, you hear this sort of discordant noise of the city, all these different sounds of the city, and then above all that, this mood of young men singing. Really, really cool. Then there's a poem called "Eating a Dollar Slice in the Rain," and the subtitle here says "For Carly." And this sort of illustrates, you know, about the capitalism part of the title here. It's not so much an anti-capitalism message in these poems, I don't think. There's a bit, but mostly it's the side of capitalism that is the struggle of capitalism, right? And so this particular poem, Eating a Dollar Slice in the Rain, the poem opens by saying, all the money I've spent on cheap umbrellas, I could have bought the greatest umbrella in the world. But, then it says at one point in the poem, it indicates, poverty forces short-sightedness. So, if you only have money to buy the cheap umbrella and it's raining, that's what you do. Then there's a poem called Poem Written by My Dad After Leaving the Dominican Republic, 1979. And I love the way this poem starts, because the poem starts off by saying, what of those who didn't sing even one word of the song? I love that. Of those proclaiming rest, of those poisoned by calm. This poem is just so beautiful, and sort of nostalgic. And, what about those who left? Then there's this poem I mentioned earlier where he learns his grandmother was also a poet, and the title of the poem is On Learning My Grandmother Was Also a Poet. And in this poem, his dad tells him the story in this poem. It tells sort of a story that his dad takes him to this radio station where his grandmother used to read poems, and he didn't know his grandmother was a poet and had written poems and read them, on the radio. And the poem goes on to sort of describe his grandmother's poems have been lost to time. And then he just sort of muses on the radio waves, right? Sort of going out through time into sort of infinity, and how that's still reverberating, that message, those poems of his grandmother are still out there somewhere. I thought that was so beautiful. Then perhaps this was my favorite poem of the collection. It's called Autumn Evening at the Laundromat. It's a very short little poem, but it says, if you want to feel like a winner for once, put a $10 bill into the change machine. The poem then continues on, but that mood, if you've ever put money into like a bill into a change machine and you get the change, and then there's a certain feeling you get. You feel kind of rich, right? And that noise, that sound of the coins, it makes you feel like you won something, like a slot machine, right? So that mood that this poem set was just so cool, and I loved that. There's a poem called Hearing SpiderMan Speaking Spanish in Times Square. This one's really cool. You know how in Times Square and other sort of places where a lot of tourists gather, there will be these superheroes and these people from pop culture dressed up like people from pop culture, and you can get your picture made with them. And so he sees this Spider-Man that's a little overweight, not exactly like the Spider-Man that we think of necessarily, but the kids don't care. It still looks like Spider-Man to them, and they're excited, and he hears this Spider-Man speaking Spanish, and he talks about how if others heard that, they might tell him to go back where he came from, and he would get harassed or whatever. But the last lines of this poem I think are so cool. It says, he's the hero for a few dollars, constantly reminded of the importance of keeping his secret identity. So several meanings there, several layers of meaning. And this poem, my mom thinks she sees a UFO over Guatemala while sitting at the bus stop just before the earthquake of 1976. I think this poem is really Ariel Francisco. It's really got this vibe of this poet, this sort of his style. And the poem talks about how his mom sees this light. It's sort of this amazing thing she sees just out of the blue. She didn't expect it. She's at the bus stop. And then he says, like her, I hope that I will grow up to look up in the sky for hope, for wonder, whatever. And then the last line of the poem says, like her, I will grow up to look up and see the bus I missed going on without me. So it brings us right back down to sort of that sort of everyday world, everyday sort of occurrence that are so frequently described in his poetry, which I just love. Finally, the last poem that I'll chat about here is called A Beautiful Sunday Afternoon. And I love this poem. It's just one of the most beautiful ones in the collection, I think. It's about a morning, and he wakes up kind of in a hangover on his friend's couch. You know, and it's a strange apartment. It's not his normal place, so everything's sort of odd. But he hears these sounds. He hears his friends have already started drinking coffee. They're drinking coffee. He hears these neighborhood sounds. Somebody's practicing the saxophone. And so he can hear, you know, birds. And the last line of the poem, I think, is just gorgeous. It says, "It's almost too beautiful to bear, but I bear it." That feeling, you know, sometimes when it's just too beautiful or too sad or whatever, and you know, that emotion is on you and it just fills you really to the brim, and you don't know quite if you can take it, you know, but you do. I just think that's a beautiful sort of, a beautiful expression of emotion. So I'll leave the chat there. Under Capitalism, if your head aches, they just yank off your head. Poetry collection by Ariel Francisco. So yeah, I'm a fan, but and I'm glad I discovered this poet. I love spending time with his poetry, and I don't think I read enough poetry, but I'm trying to get better at it because I love it. I love spending time with these poems. So, all right, I will leave this chat there. My next chat, it's going to be Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. I have already finished this, so I will have a chat up on this coming up very soon. Until next time, take care.